Get out of my house. Emma Carter's scream split the frozen mountain air, and this time someone heard it. Nathan Harrison had been watching from the ridge for 3 weeks, and he had seen enough. He came down that slope in the bitter cold, his boots crushing ice, his jaw set like stone, and he put himself between Emma and the man who had been destroying her one winter day at a time. Stay with us. This story will break your heart and then rebuild it. Subscribe, hit the bell, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? Emma didn't cry anymore. She'd used up her tears somewhere around October, when the first snow came early, and Roy broke 2 of her ribs over a pot of burned stew. She'd lain on that floor for 4 hours before she could stand. No doctor, no neighbor close enough to matter, no phone that Roy hadn't smashed against the wall back in September when she'd tried to call her sister in Billings. Just the cold, just the dark, just the sound of wind dragging itself across the Montana mountains, like something wounded that couldn't find its way home. She'd learned to function around the pain. That was the thing people who'd never been hit, didn't understand you, didn't stop moving just because something was broken. You adapted. You found ways to breathe that didn't catch on the bruised ribs. You learned which floorboards creaked and which ones didn't, so you could move through the cabin without waking him. You learned the exact sound of his truck coming up the mountain road, the particular rattle of the left front axle, and you used those 30 seconds of warning to compose your face into something neutral and soft, because neutral and soft kept the hitting to a minimum. Emma Carter had become a student of survival without ever meaning to. She was 34 years old and she felt like 60. The cabin sat on the eastern slope of a ridge that didn't even have a proper name on most maps, just a dotted line and the notation, Private Access Road. Roy had bought it 3 years ago with inheritance money from his uncle, and he'd brought Emma up here with promises about clean air and a fresh start and a life away from the noise of Missoula. She'd believed him. That was the part that still made her stomach turn even now. She'd believed him completely, because in the beginning he'd been careful and kind, and he'd looked at her like she was something worth protecting. It hadn't lasted 6 months before the real Roy showed himself. And out here, there was nowhere to go. She'd tried once back in the spring, loaded a bag while he was sleeping off a drunk, and walked the 4 miles down the access road to where it met the county highway. Stood there in the gray morning with her bag and her split lip and her arm that she was pretty sure was fractured, and waited for a car to come. One came eventually. A neighbor from 3 ridges over man named Pete Gruber, who Roy drank with on Saturdays. Pete had looked at her standing there on the roadside, looked at her face, and then he'd looked away. "You need a ride somewhere, Emma." And she'd started to say yes. She needed to go to town. She needed help. And then she'd seen Pete's jaw set in that particular way that men's jaws set when they'd already decided not to get involved. And she'd understood that Pete Gruber was going to drive her exactly nowhere except back to Roy. He'd driven her home. Roy had been awake and waiting. That had been a bad week. After that, she stopped thinking about leaving and started thinking about surviving. The morning. Roy hit her and left for Cobb's place. Emma gave herself exactly 3 minutes to feel whatever she needed to feel. She stood in the center of the cabin's main room, one hand pressed to her cheekbone, and she breathed through her nose in slow, deliberate counts. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. She'd read about that breathing technique in a magazine at a dentist's office in what felt like another life, and she'd committed it to memory because she'd understood even then that she would need it. When the 3 minutes were up, she moved. First, the fire. The wood stove in the corner had burned down to almost nothing, and without heat, the cabin would drop to dangerous temperatures inside 2 hours in this cold. She'd learned to keep a supply of split wood just inside the door, where Roy couldn't claim she was sneaking around, and she fed the stove carefully, building the fire back up the way her father had taught her when she was 7 years old back in Wyoming. Her father. God, she hadn't let herself think about him in months. He'd been dead 6 years, and sometimes that felt like a mercy, that he wasn't alive to see what she'd become, what she'd let herself become. She stopped that thought hard. That kind of thinking, the "you let this happen" variety, was a trap she'd learned to recognize. Roy had been the one doing the hitting. Roy was the one who'd isolated her up here on this mountain. Roy was the one who'd smashed the phone and taken the truck keys and told every person within 20 miles that Emma was unstable, prone to stories not to be believed. She hadn't let anything happen. She'd been caught. There was a difference. The fire caught and held. She went to the small mirror propped above the washstand and assessed the damage to her face with the same clinical remove she brought to everything now. The cheekbone was swollen, already purpling, but the skin hadn't split. She'd have a spectacular bruise by tomorrow and would need to avoid Roy's gaze for the next several days because he didn't like looking at the evidence of what he'd done. It made him angry all over again, which made no logical sense and was nonetheless absolutely true. She pressed a cloth wrung out in cold water against the swelling and held it there. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving through the spruce trees on the ridge above the cabin, that low, steady moan that said another front was coming through. She'd gotten reasonably good at reading the mountain weather, not as good as someone who'd grown up in these mountains, but good enough. Good enough to know that the next 48 hours were going to be brutal, and that Roy would probably be at Cobb's place until it passed, drinking and playing cards and leaving her to manage alone, which was honestly better than the alternative. She turned from the mirror and began taking stock of the kitchen stores. She was counting the remaining cans on the second shelf, 14, which was fewer than she'd like with a storm coming, when she had the feeling she was being watched. It wasn't an instinct she'd been born with. It was one she'd developed out of necessity, the way you develop any skill when your life depends on it. She'd learned to register things at the edge of her awareness before she consciously understood what she was registering: a shift in the quality of light through the window, a sound that was half a beat off from the normal rhythms of the mountain. She went very still. Then slowly, she turned toward the window. There was a man on the ridge. I was standing at the tree line, maybe 150 yards up the slope, just at the edge of the spruce forest, and he was big. Even at that distance, she could see he was a large man, the kind of large that said he'd worked outdoors his whole life, and the mountain had made him that way. He was wearing a heavy coat and a dark hat, and he had what looked like a rifle slung across his back. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there. Her first instinct, the one that Roy had spent 2 years training into her, was fear. Stranger, danger, unknown. She felt her body go tight and her breath catch the old familiar constriction. Then her second instinct kicked in. The one that predated Roy. The one that was purely Emma. She looked at the man on the ridge and thought, he's been there a while. And she thought, he saw Roy hit me. And she thought, he hasn't moved. He's not coming down. He's just watching. Men who meant harm didn't stand at 150 yards and watch. Men who meant harm moved, came close, used their size. This man was just standing. She turned back to her cans and finished counting. Roy came back 3 days later, which was 2 days into the storm she'd predicted. He came back in the way. He sometimes did after a bad spell. Quieter than usual, carrying supplies he'd picked up at the store in town, not quite meeting her eyes. Emma had learned to recognize this phase. It was the part of the cycle she thought of in her private mind as the aftermath quiet. He wouldn't hit her for a while now. He'd be subdued, almost domestic. He'd expect her to be grateful for it. She was grateful for it. She was also furious about being grateful for it, but she'd learned to keep that particular emotion buried deep. "Brought flour," he said, setting a bag on the table. "And coffee." "Thank you. Storm's supposed to break by Friday." "Good." He looked at her face, then at the bruise, and she watched something move through his expression. Not guilt exactly, never quite guilt, but a kind of uncomfortable acknowledgement. "You put ice on that?" "Yes." He nodded and moved past her to hang up his coat. Emma stood at the stove and stirred the soup she'd been making from the last of the stock she'd had, and she thought about the man on the ridge. She'd seen him twice more in the 3 days. Roy had been gone once in the early morning, moving through the trees above the cabin at a distance, and once in the afternoon when she'd gone out to bring in more wood and looked up, and there he was, maybe 100 yards off, watching her work. The second time she'd stopped. She'd stood with her arms full of firewood and looked directly up at him. He hadn't moved, hadn't waved, hadn't called out. But after a moment, he'd done something that stayed with her. He'd given us a single slow nod. The kind that wasn't hello and wasn't goodbye. The kind that said, "I see you." She'd carried her wood inside and stood by the stove for a long time. A week passed. Roy's aftermath quiet stretched longer than usual, which made Emma cautious rather than relieved. Long quiet periods meant tension building, underground pressure finding no outlet, and when it finally erupted, it was always worse for having been held back. She'd learned to prefer the shorter cycles, hit, quiet, calm hit, because the long ones had a way of exploding catastrophically. She managed the house. She cooked and cleaned and kept the fire and did all the things she'd been doing since she arrived on this mountain, and she thought constantly about the man on the ridge. She didn't see him after Roy came back. That told her something. He'd known Roy was there. He'd stayed away or stayed hidden while Roy was present, which meant he was aware of Roy, aware of what Roy was, and was making deliberate calculations about proximity and risk. That wasn't the behavior of someone who stumbled up here by accident. That was the behavior of someone who was paying attention. On a Friday afternoon, Roy went out to check on the snowmobiles in the lean-to, and Emma moved quickly to the window on the north side of the cabin, the one that faced up the ridge, and looked. He was there, closer than before. Maybe 70 yards, standing at the edge of the trees where a big fallen spruce created a natural screen. She made a decision so fast, it surprised her. She raised her hand, just lifted it palm open, and held it for 3 seconds. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he raised his hand in return. She stepped back from the window before Roy came back inside. The first time Nathan Harrison actually spoke to her, she almost shot him. She'd gone out before dawn 3 days later to check the small snare line she'd set in the brush 100 yards east of the cabin. Roy knew about the snares in principle and didn't object because they occasionally produced rabbits, which meant food he didn't have to pay for, and Roy was nothing if not practical about things that benefited him directly. What Roy didn't know was that she'd also been using the snare line as an excuse to get out of the cabin alone for 20 minutes every few days, because those 20 minutes were the only time she felt like she could breathe properly. She was crouching over the third snare empty, like the first two, when she heard a footstep in the snow, 6 feet behind her. She spun, grabbed the skinning knife from her belt, and had it raised before she'd consciously processed what she was reacting to. I was even bigger up close. 6'4", maybe taller, broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that suggested bone and muscle rather than anything soft. He was probably 50 or somewhere in that range. His face had deep-set lines from weather and time, and his hair, where it showed under his hat, was dark, threaded through with gray. He had calm, dark eyes that didn't so much as flicker when she pulled the knife. He looked at the knife. He looked at her face, at the remains of the bruise which had gone from purple to yellow-green over the past 10 days. He looked back at her eyes. "Smart," he said, "keeping a knife on you." She didn't lower it. "Who are you?" "Nathan Harrison. I've got a cabin about 2 miles north up past the second ridge." He paused. "I've been watching you." "I know." That seemed to surprise him slightly. "You knew?" "Since the first morning. You're not hard to spot." Something crossed his face that might have been the start of a smile, though it didn't complete. "Fair enough. I've been trying to figure out the right way to approach without spooking you." "You can start by telling me what you want." He looked at her steadily. "I want to know if you're all right." The directness of it hit her like a physical thing. She'd been handling conversational angles and sideways approaches and careful navigation of Roy's moods for so long that a straight question felt almost disorienting. She tightened her grip on the knife. "I'm fine." "Your cheekbone disagrees." "That's not your business." "No," he said simply. "It's not. But I've been watching for 3 weeks, and I've counted 7 times your husband's left that cabin in a state that suggested he'd just hurt someone, and you're the only other person in it. So I'm making it my business on account of that." He said it without heat, without judgment, just as a statement of observed fact. "You don't have to tell me anything. You don't have to talk to me at all. I'll walk away right now if that's what you want." She searched his face for the thing she was always looking for in men's faces. Now the angle, the thing underneath what was being said. Roy had been charming once. Roy had been all concern and care, and she'd believed every word. Nathan Harrison's face was like the mountain itself. It told her nothing she didn't already know. There was no performance here. He was just standing in the cold, stating the truth as he understood it and waiting. "I don't know what you think you can do," she said. "I'm not sure either. Probably not as much as I'd like." He glanced toward the cabin. "How long does he usually stay when he comes back from Cobb's place?" The question was so specific, so practically targeted, that she answered it before she thought about it. "Depends. Anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks." Nathan nodded slowly, filing that information. "And you, is there anyone you're trying to reach, family, someone in town?" "My sister's in Billings. Roy smashed my phone. I haven't talked to her in 4 months." She stopped, surprised at herself. She hadn't said that out loud before. She hadn't said anything out loud before to anyone, because there'd been no one to say anything to. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity would have made her want to cut him. Something older and quieter than pity. "All right," he said. "Here's what I can offer. I'm not going to pretend I can fix your situation. That's your life and your choice to make. But I can make you less alone in it if you'll let me." She studied him. "Why?" "Because it's the right thing." He said it like it was the only possible answer, like it hadn't even required consideration. "And because I've watched what's been happening in that cabin for 3 weeks, and I'm not built to keep watching and do nothing." Emma Carter had not trusted a man in 2 years. She stood in the snow with her knife still raised, and she looked at Nathan Harrison, and she did the calculation that she'd learned to do, the survival calculation, the one that weighed risk against resource isolation, against exposure, staying still against moving. She lowered the knife. "Don't come near the cabin when he's home," she said. "He'll use any excuse." "I know that. And if he finds out you've been talking to me, he won't find out." "You can't promise that." "I can promise that I've lived on this mountain for 11 years, and I've gotten very good at moving through it without being seen when I don't want to be seen." He said it without bravado, just as information. "I'll take your word on when it's safe to approach." She thought about it for another moment. The wind was picking up again, curling through the trees with that particular edge that meant temperatures dropping. "There's a birch stand about a quarter-mile east," she said. "If I can get out there, I'll leave a marked scratch on the 3rd tree from the path when Roy's going to be gone, and for how long." He looked at her with something that was unmistakably respect. "That works," he said. He turned and walked back into the trees and was gone so smoothly that within 30 seconds she couldn't be sure which direction he'd gone. Emma stood alone in the snow and realized her hands had stopped shaking. She wasn't sure when exactly they'd started. The first time Nathan came to the cabin when Roy was gone, he brought things. That surprised her more than anything. She'd expected him to come and talk, to ask more questions, to do what people who meant well always did, which was talk at her about her situation, without any particular understanding of what her situation actually required. He came with a canvas pack, and he set it on the table, and he unpacked it without ceremony. "Dried venison," he said, setting it down. "Coffee, real coffee, not that cheap stuff. A hand warmer that'll burn for 6 hours. Extra matches, waterproof case." He set down a small, sturdy folding knife, different from the skinning knife she carried, smaller and lighter. "That's easier to conceal if you need to carry it inside." Then a small flat object that she recognized after a moment as a satellite communicator, one of the emergency beacon types. If you press that button, it sends a GPS signal and a distress call to emergency services. Range doesn't depend on cell towers. It'll work from anywhere on this mountain. She looked at the collection on the table and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like someone was taking her seriously. "I can't pay you for any of this," she said. "I didn't ask you to. Roy will notice if... The venison's yours to say you caught and smoked. The coffee you mix into the existing supply, he won't know the difference. The other things stay hidden." He pointed to the knife. "Waistband back. The communicator somewhere he doesn't look." She thought about the loose board under the northeast corner of the sleeping loft. Roy had never found it in 3 years. "I need to show you something," Nathan said. He pulled a hand-drawn map from his coat pocket. Hand-drawn but precise, the kind that came from years of walking terrain until it was part of you. He spread it on the table and pointed to 2 locations. "That's us," he said, tapping the lower point. "That's my cabin." He tapped the upper one. "That's 2 miles, but there's a path, not the access road, a foot trail through the tree line that cuts it to about 1.5 miles. Mostly sheltered. It doesn't cross any open terrain Roy could see from the road." She leaned over the map, studying it. "If you ever need to move fast," he said, "you take that path. You don't go back to the access road. You go north through the trees." He traced the route with one finger. "There's a rock formation about halfway. You'll know it looks like a flat table laid on its side. You stop there and fire 3 shots in the air if you have a gun, or trigger the communicator. I'll come. You can't guarantee you'll hear shots from 2 miles. On a quiet mountain day I can. If the weather's bad, use the communicator." His voice was matter-of-fact. "I want you to know you have options. That's all. I'm not telling you what to do." Emma looked at the map. She looked at the things he'd brought. She looked up at Nathan Harrison, this large, quiet man who'd spent 3 weeks watching out of concern, and then brought her practical tools instead of useless sympathy. And she asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since the morning she'd first seen him at the tree line. "Why are you doing this? And I mean really. People don't just, they don't." She paused. "Pete Gruber drove me home." Something crossed Nathan's face at that. Something with some darkness in it. "I know Pete Gruber." "Gruber," he said. "Then you know why I'm asking." I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother. She stayed with a man who hurt her for 11 years. I was 12 when she finally got out, and that was only because a neighbor woman, a woman who didn't have to do anything, who wasn't family, who didn't have any particular stake in it, that woman made herself useful. Brought food, kept watch, made sure my mother knew she wasn't invisible." He stopped. "I'm not looking to be a hero. I'm looking to be a useful neighbor." Emma sat down at the table, which she hadn't planned to do. 11 years, she said. 11 years. Did she? Emma stopped. Is she okay now? She died 4 years ago. Natural causes. She had 14 good years after she left. He said it straight without performance. 14 years of being a whole person. That mattered. It counted. Emma looked down at the table. Roy is going to come back in 2 days, she said. Possibly 3. I'll be gone before dark. You should know that Cobb, the man Roy drinks with, he's been here twice in the last month. Roy's been telling people I'm not well, that I say things that aren't true. She looked up. If this ever gets complicated, that's the story they'll use. Nathan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still. Roy's been laying groundwork. Yes. For what do you think? It was the question she'd been turning over for months alone in the cold dark. She'd been trying not to look at it straight on, because looking at it straight on was terrifying. I don't know, she said, but I know it's not good. Nathan gathered the map back into his coat. Then we'll be ready for whatever it is. He left the way he came through the north side of the property, where the tree cover ran close, and Emma stood at the table and looked at the food and the tools and the small satellite communicator that was the first working lifeline she'd had to the outside world in 4 months. She tucked the knife into her waistband back where her shirt would cover it. She felt the weight of it settle against her spine. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Emma Carter felt like something other than prey. Roy came back in 2 days, and he was not in a good mood. She heard the truck coming up the road and did the thing she always did. Composed her face, killed her eyes, made herself into the version of Emma that caused the least friction. She'd gotten so practiced at it that she could do it in under 10 seconds. It was perhaps the saddest skill she'd ever developed. He came through the door with cold radiating off him and something tightly coiled in his movements that she recognized immediately. This wasn't the aftermath quiet Roy. This was the underneath it Roy, the one with something building that hadn't found its shape yet. It's cold in here, he said, though it wasn't. She'd kept the stove well fed. I just built the fire up an hour ago. Doesn't feel like it. She didn't argue. Arguing was a wire. She'd learned exactly which wires not to touch. He moved through the cabin, touching things, checking things, in the way he sometimes did when he was suspicious without a specific target for the suspicion. She watched him from the stove and kept her breathing even, and thought with one part of her mind about the knife in her waistband, and the communicator under the floorboard, and the man 2 miles north who knew she existed. Roy's hand landed on the coffee tin. He turned looking at it. This is different. Emma's chest seized, but her face stayed neutral. I found some old stock at the back of the shelf, mixed it in. He looked at the tin for another moment. He looked at her. Then he set it down. Make me a cup. Of course. She made him coffee with steady hands and told herself clearly and without drama that she needed to be more careful. And she told herself the other thing, the thing that was new that she was still getting used to. She wasn't alone up here anymore. 3 nights later, she heard Roy on the CB radio he kept in the lean-to. She wasn't supposed to know about the CB. He'd never mentioned it, and she'd only discovered it when she'd gone in for firewood during one of his absences and noticed the equipment under a tarp on the back shelf. She hadn't touched it. She hadn't shown any sign she knew it existed. But the lean-to shared a wall with the cabin's east side, and on a quiet night with the wind lying down, you could hear through it if you pressed yourself against the interior wall in the right spot. She heard Roy's voice low and clipped talking to someone. She caught fragments, only the wall was too solid for full sentences. Can't wait much longer. She's going to be a problem. When the weather opens up, I want it. She didn't catch everything. She didn't need to. She went back to the main room and sat by the stove, and she turned over in her mind every piece of what she had Roy laying groundwork. Roy telling people she was unstable. Roy on a radio in the lean-to talking about a problem and what he wanted when the weather opened up. She went to the northeast corner of the sleeping loft. She lifted the loose board. She held the satellite communicator in both hands for a long time. Then she put it back. Not yet. She didn't have enough yet. And moving too soon, moving before she understood what she was moving away from. That was how you ended up back at the roadside with Pete Gruber's jaw setting like concrete. But she started sleeping with the knife. And the next morning when Roy left to check the traps he'd set along the south ridge, she made a mark on the third birch tree from the path. Within 2 hours, she heard a soft knock at the cabin's north door, the one that faced the trees. She opened it. Nathan stood in the cold, reading her face like a text he'd been trained to decode. What happened? He said. She told him everything. Nathan sat at her table and listened without interruption, which was rarer than it should have been. Emma had forgotten what it felt like to speak, and have someone simply receive what she said without redirecting, without offering opinions, mid-sentence, without making it about themselves. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He's talking to Cobb, he said. I can't prove that. You don't have to prove it to me. Cobb runs things in this valley that aren't legal, and Roy's been useful to him. I've seen some of what moves through this part of the mountain, and it's not hunting supplies. He said it without dramatics. Roy's got some kind of arrangement with Cobb, and you're in the way of something. Or you're part of something. I'm not sure which is worse. Emma looked at him. What do you mean part of something? Property, Nathan said, and he held her gaze while he said it, so she understood he wasn't softening it. Woman up here on a mountain, no phone, no contacts, who'd believe her already been set up as unstable. That's not an accident. That's a situation someone built. The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the temperature. How long? She said. How long do you think this has been? Planned, I don't know. But from what you're telling me about the phone and Pete Gruber and the CB and the layering of stories, Roy's not stupid. He's been building this for a while. She sat with that. I have 14 cans of food and a knife, she said, and a satellite communicator and a trail that I know and you know. His voice was level. And I've been on this mountain 11 years, and I know where Cobb's people come from, and how they move, and what they're not expecting. What are they not expecting? Someone who's been paying attention, he said, and a woman who's harder to move than they think she is. Emma looked across the table at Nathan Harrison and thought about her mother, who died saying she wished she'd been braver, and her sister in Billings, who didn't know where she was, and the 14 good years Nathan's mother had lived after. Tell me what I need to know, she said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Let's start with the trail, he said. I want you to know it well enough to walk it in the dark." Outside, the wind was picking up again, working itself against the cabin's walls, testing them for weakness, the way everything on this mountain did. Emma Carter leaned forward over the map and began to learn the terrain of her own escape, every ridge, every hollow, every rock formation that Nathan had walked 1,000 times and now laid out before her like a gift. She memorized it the way she'd memorized everything that kept her alive on this mountain. Completely. Without mercy toward herself. "Say it back to me," Nathan said. "North from the cabin door 40 yards to the big spruce with the split trunk. Left at the split trunk, follow the tree line uphill for about a 1/4 mile until the ground flattens. When it flattens, I'll see the rock formation looks like a table laid on its side. From there, I keep the ridge to my right, and I'll hit your property line in another 1/2 mile. Your cabin is the first structure past the line. In the dark. In the dark, I count steps from the split spruce. You said 212 to the flat ground." He looked at her steadily. 214. "Then I'll recount." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, the expression of a man who'd expected competence and found something beyond it. "You've got a good head for this." "I've had to." He didn't respond to that directly, which was the right instinct. Instead, he folded the map and slid it across the table to her. "Keep it. You know where to hide things." She took it and looked at it once more before folding it smaller, small enough to fit behind the loose board with the communicator. "Roy checks the loft sometimes." "Does he know about the board?" "No, but he's thorough when he's looking for something." "Then give me a sense of his pattern. When he searches, what triggers it?" She thought about that. It was the kind of question that required her to think about Roy, the way she'd been trying not to think about him as a tactical problem with observable behaviors, rather than a source of constant ambient terror. She made herself do it anyway. He searches after he comes back from Cobb's, and something's bothered him. Not something I did necessarily. Something that happened there, some conversation that put him in a suspicious frame of mind. He comes back wound up, and he starts touching things and moving through the cabin like he's checking inventory. He's looking for evidence of something, but he doesn't always know what. Has he ever found anything? Once. A letter I'd written to my sister that I never sent. I'd hidden it in the lining of my winter coat. She paused. That was 8 months ago. That was a bad week. Nathan's jaw tightened barely perceptibly. After that, did his pattern change? Did he search more frequently? She thought about it. No. Less, actually. I think finding it satisfied something. He thought he'd found the thing I was hiding, and that it was just a letter, just homesickness, and he could manage that. So he stopped looking as hard. "Smart," Nathan said, and she understood he meant it as tactical observation, not compliment. "He thinks he knows what level of defiance you're capable of." "Yes. And you've been careful not to show him otherwise." "Every day." He nodded slowly. "That's going to be your advantage when this comes to a head. He's going to underestimate what you're able to do." She looked at him across the table. "You sound certain this comes to a head." "I heard what you heard through that wall. Roy's waiting for the weather to open up. That means there's a timeline." His voice was even, but the weight behind it was real. "We need to be ready before he thinks we can be." Emma turned that over. "We." It was a small word, and it hit her in a place she hadn't expected, that particular hollow that opens up in a person who's been operating alone for too long. "What do you know about Cobb?" she said. Nathan's expression shifted into something more careful. "Enough to know he's dangerous, and he's been operating in this valley without interference for a long time. He runs poaching operations commercial scale, not subsistence, and he moves things through the mountain corridors that I've never gotten close enough to identify, but I've got suspicions." He stopped. "He's also got at least 2 men who work for him directly. One of them is a man named Vicar, who I've seen at Roy's cabin twice. Big Younger does what he's told. I don't know that name. Roy's never mentioned it." "Roy wouldn't. If Vicar's been to the cabin, that's business. Roy's keeping separate from you, which means it's business he doesn't want you to know about." He leaned back slightly. "Emma, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the answer is uncomfortable." "All right." Is there anything of value on this property? Anything Roy has that would be worth protecting through arrangements? She thought about it. Really thought about it, going through everything she knew about the land, the cabin, the property. The water rights, she said slowly. There's a spring on the northeast corner of the property that feeds into the Valley Creek system. Roy talked about it when he bought the land. He said, whoever controlled that spring had leverage over the 3 properties downstream. Nathan went very still. He talked about it once, Emma continued. In the first year, he said that was part of why he bought this specific property, the spring, and the access it gave to the valley watershed. And the downstream properties, Nathan said quietly. Who owns them? I don't know, Roy didn't say. Nathan stood up from the table slowly and moved to the north window and stood there for a moment with his back to her. She could see the set of his shoulders, and she'd become good enough at reading people's bodies. Roy had made her an expert out of necessity to understand that what she'd just said had landed somewhere significant. Nathan, he turned back. One of those downstream properties is a family that's been there 4 generations, the Aldersons. They run cattle. They've had water disputes with various parties in this valley for 30 years. He paused. Cobb's been trying to get control of the upper watershed for at least 5 years. He's had 2 legal attempts blocked. The understanding arrived cold and complete. Roy didn't buy this property for a fresh start, Emma said. No. He bought it for the spring. I think so. She sat with that for a moment. 2 years of her life. 2 years of fists and cold floors and Pete Gruber's jaw and letters she never sent. And 14 good years. Nathan's mother never got to live inside this marriage, and the center of it wasn't even about her. It had never been about her. She was incidental. She was just a woman Roy had brought along to make the property look like a home. The anger that moved through her then was different from anything she'd felt before. It wasn't the hot, desperate anger of being hit, or the cold, numb anger of chronic survival. It was something cleaner and more dangerous. The anger of a woman who has understood completely. What does he need me for? She said. Her voice was steady. If I'm just an inconvenience, if I'm going to be a problem, he needs the marriage intact until the water rights transfer is formalized. Any legal dispute over the property is cleaner with a stable household. Nathan said it carefully. After that? He stopped. She looked at him. After that I'm the problem, she said. That's my read. Yes. Emma nodded once. The motion was small and precise. Then we don't have as much time as I thought. No, Nathan said. We don't. Roy came back from checking his traps in a better mood than he'd left, in which meant he'd had success, which meant he'd be good for at least a day. Emma cooked the 2 rabbits he brought in and listened to him talk about the South Ridge and the conditions and his plans for extending the trap line east, and she tracked every word for information the way she'd been doing for months, but now with a different kind of purpose. I was waiting for weather. He'd said so on the radio. The weather right now was cold but clear, which meant the window could open any day. She needed to know more, and she needed to know it fast. Cobb came by while you were at the traps, she said. A lie delivered flat. Roy's fork stopped moving. What? I heard a truck. I looked out. I think it was his, the dark one with the cracked windshield. She paused. He didn't stop, just slowed down and kept going. Roy set down his fork. He was thinking she could see him thinking, and what she was watching for was the specific quality of his expression. Whether the lie landed as believable, whether it produced the shape of reaction that said he had something to be twitchy about. It did. His jaw tightened, and his eyes went slightly unfocused the way they did when he was recalculating something internal. Probably just driving through, he said. Probably. He picked up his fork again, but he was eating mechanically now, not enjoying it, and 3 minutes later he pushed back from the table and said he was going to check the snowmobiles, the lean-to, the radio. She washed dishes and listened to the wall. The voices were clearer tonight. Either the cold had tightened the wood, or the wind had died enough to stop interfering. She pressed herself against the interior wall and listened, and this time she caught more than fragments. Roy's voice tense and low. She didn't see anything. And then a voice she didn't recognize scratchy through the CB static. "You sure about that?" "Roy. She doesn't go out. She doesn't talk to anyone. She doesn't know." The other voice. "Cobb wants the paperwork moved up." "Roy. I told him after the thaw. I need more time to." The other voice cutting him off. "Cobb doesn't wait." "Roy." A long silence. Roy's voice quieter. "Fine. 2 weeks. Tell him 2 weeks." Emma walked back to the stove and stood over the dishwater and thought 2 weeks. She made the mark on the birch tree the next morning before dawn, while Roy was still sleeping. Nathan came within the hour. She told him what she'd heard. He listened the way he always did, completely without interruption, processing it in that still deliberate way of his, that she'd come to understand wasn't slowness, but the opposite. He was moving fast inside while his exterior held steady, and by the time she finished talking, he'd already worked through the geometry of it. 2 weeks, he said. That's the window. What do we do? First thing you need to know the trail in the dark. Tonight if we can manage it. How long does Roy sleep? Heavy until about 4 in the morning, lighter after that. I'll be at the split spruce at 2. You walk the trail with me all the way to my cabin and back. We do it once tonight, and once more before the 2 weeks are up, so it's in your body, not just your head. She thought about the risks of that, the cold, the darkness. Roy waking early, any number of ways it could go wrong. She weighed them against the alternative. 2 in the morning, she said. I'll be there. He looked at her with that same steady expression that had over these weeks become something she reached for when the fear got bad, not for reassurance exactly, but for the reminder that someone competent was paying attention. There's something else, he said. I need to tell you about Vicar. The name again. You said he's Cobb's man. He is, but I've also seen him coming up the access road twice in the past week after dark, stopping at the top and watching the cabin and then leaving. He said it plainly. He's been doing reconnaissance. Emma processed that. He's learning the property. He's learning your patterns. When lights go on, when they go off. When Roy's truck is there, and when it isn't. The understanding arrived like a stone dropping into still water. They're not going to wait for Roy to handle this himself, she said. I don't think so. I think Roy is slower than Cobb wants, and Cobb's sending Vicar to move up the timeline from the outside. She thought about the satellite communicator under the floorboard. She thought about the trail to Nathan's cabin. She thought about 2 weeks, which might now be 1 week or 3 days, or tomorrow night. Nathan, she said, if I have to go, I might have to go fast. No time to get the things under the board. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a second satellite communicator, smaller than the one he'd given her, a different model. Carry this one on you, in your waistband where the knife is. He set it on the table. If the one under the board is all you can get, use that. But if you have to run without stopping, you'll have this one. She picked it up, lighter than she expected. I want you to think about something, he said. The communicator gets emergency services to you inside of 2 hours in good conditions. But 2 hours is a long time if Vicar comes to that cabin with intention. I know. So I want you to have a signal. Something you do or say if he comes, and Roy's not there. Something that tells me to come right then, rather than waiting. She thought about it. The north window. If I put the red cloth in the north window, it means come now. Nathan looked at the north window. I'll be watching. What's the cloth look like? There's a red wool scarf on the hook by the door. It's the only red thing in the cabin. He nodded. Red scarf in the north window. I come immediately. How fast? 20 minutes in good conditions. 20 minutes was also a long time. She could see on his face that he knew she was thinking that. I'll try to position myself closer in, he said. There's a point on the ridge about 40 yards out where I can watch the window and still have cover. In this cold, I've spent longer in worse. Emma looked at him and thought about this man who'd built a life alone on a mountain, who hunted and trapped and existed with a kind of self-contained competence that she'd begun to recognize as something more complex than simple solitude. He'd made choices that kept him here by himself for 11 years. She hadn't asked about them yet. She wasn't going to ask about them now. 2 o'clock, she said. I'll be at the spruce. She was at the split spruce at 1:55, wearing every layer she owned, her breath clouding white in the dark air. Nathan materialized out of the tree line at exactly 2, without a sound that she'd heard, which was unsettling, in the way it always was. A man that size had no right to move that quietly. But he'd said 11 years on this mountain, and she was beginning to understand what 11 years at something did to a person's body. He had a small hooded lantern, almost no light at all. Just enough to see the ground immediately ahead, and without speaking, he turned north and she fell in behind him, and they began to walk. The trail was different in the dark. Everything she'd memorized from the map translated imperfectly to actual terrain, and she lost her footing twice in the first 100 yards. Each time before she'd fully registered, she was falling. Nathan's hand was there. One hand backward, not looking, not breaking stride, just present and steady until she found her feet. She didn't thank him for it. That felt right somehow. It wasn't rescue. It was just support. The way a railing is just a railing. She counted steps. She identified the rock formation by touch when the lantern was too dim to see it clearly, the flat top, the rough underside edge exactly as he'd described. She noted where the ground changed texture, where her boots sank, and where they held, where the wind came from, which direction, and at what strength. By the time they reached Nathan's cabin, a solid, low-built structure that felt warm before she even stepped inside, that had the smell of wood smoke and dry wood, and something that was simply human habitation maintained with care. She'd committed the trail to something deeper than memory. She'd committed it to her body. She stood in the middle of Nathan's cabin for about 60 seconds. She looked at his wood stove, his shelves of dry goods, the equipment on the wall arranged with the precision of someone who'd learned that finding what you needed fast could matter. She looked at the single window facing south. "We go back now," she said. He looked at her without surprise. Yes. They walked back at the dark, and she led this time, and she made 2 wrong turns and corrected both of them without Nathan saying anything. And when she reached the split spruce and the light from the cabin windows was visible through the trees, she stopped and turned. "Same time in 5 days," she said. "I'll be here." She went inside. Roy was breathing in the rhythm of deep sleep. She took off her outer layers and hung them, and got into bed, and lay there with her eyes open for a long time, feeling the cold still in her bones, thinking about the trail and counting 214 steps from the split spruce to the flat ground. She was almost asleep when she heard it. A sound from outside that wasn't the wind and wasn't the trees. She lay perfectly still. Listened. The sound came again, the particular compression of snow under something heavier than an animal and lighter than a truck. Footsteps slow and careful on the north side of the cabin. She didn't move. The footsteps paused. She could feel the pause. Whatever was out there was standing still close to the north wall, doing the same thing she was doing, listening. After 30 seconds that felt considerably longer. The footsteps moved again back the way they'd come, receding, gone. She lay in the dark and thought about Vicar. She thought about him learning her patterns. She thought about the fact that the pattern he'd just observed was a dark cabin with no movement. Exactly what he'd expect to see at 2:30 in the morning. Except she'd been gone for 2 hours. If he'd been watching earlier, if he'd noted the window dark earlier, he'd have started his count then, and by the time she got back, by the time the cabin was occupied again. She stopped that line of thinking and forced herself to be methodical. He'd come and gone. He hadn't knocked, hadn't tried the door. Whatever he was doing, it was observation, not action. Not yet. But Nathan's 2 weeks might already be 1. She didn't sleep. At first light, she was at the stove with coffee made before Roy stirred, and when he came out of the sleeping loft with his hair pressed flat on one side and his eyes still slow from sleep, she put a cup in his hands and said, "I thought I heard something outside last night, north side, after midnight." Roy's hand tightened on the cup. "What kind of something?" "Footsteps, I thought. Could have been deer." He looked at her. She kept her face neutral and opened the face of a woman reporting a small, slightly unsettling thing that probably amounted to nothing. "Could have been," he said. "I couldn't sleep after. Probably just deer." He drank his coffee. He was working something over, she could see it, but he didn't say what it was, and 10 minutes later, he was talking about the trapline again. And she understood she'd done the right thing. She'd given him information that would keep him alert, and explained her own possible sleeplessness, and given herself cover for the night, all in 2 sentences that he had no reason to question. She was getting better at this. At midday, when Roy was in the lean-to, doing something mechanical with the snowmobile engine, Emma went to the north window and looked up at the ridge. Nathan was there at the 40-yard point he'd mentioned in the partial cover of a snow-heavy branch. She'd never have seen him if she hadn't known exactly where to look. He'd positioned himself with the easy naturalness of a man who'd spent years moving through terrain without being seen, and the gap in the brush where his position sat was so slight that a person not looking would never find it. He was watching the cabin. He saw her at the window. His hand moved slightly slowly. The same gesture he'd made that first morning on the ridge across 150 yards of frozen slope. "I see you." She stepped back from the window before Roy came out of the lean-to. On the 4th day, the snow came back. Heavy, steady, the kind that accumulated fast and muffled sound and rearranged the landscape. Roy spent most of the day inside, which was its own particular strain. Every hour of his presence was an hour of managed attention, of calculated neutrality, of the performance that had become so automatic, she sometimes had trouble finding the real Emma underneath it. She was chopping vegetables for soup when Roy said without preamble, "Cobb's coming up Saturday." Her knife kept moving. "Oh, business. You don't need to be around. I can take a walk if you need privacy." He looked at her. "Not in this weather. Just stay in the loft." "Of course." He went back to whatever he was reading, and Emma kept chopping and thought Saturday. Today was Tuesday. 4 days. She thought about Cobb in this cabin, in this space, sitting at this table. She thought about what business meant when the business was water rights, and Vicar coming to look at windows at 2 in the morning. She thought about the communicator in her waistband and the trail she'd walked in the dark and the red scarf on the hook by the door. That evening, Roy went to bed early. He'd been fighting something, a cold, maybe the kind of lowering that made him more tired than mean, and by 9 he was in the sleeping loft and breathing heavily. Emma waited until 11. Then she went to the north window, and very carefully, without turning on any additional light, she pressed 2 fingers against the glass in the specific pattern she and Nathan hadn't actually agreed on as a signal, but that she hoped he was still watching to see. She wasn't sure if he was there. She did it twice and stepped back. At 7 the next morning, when Roy was in the outhouse, a knock came at the north door. 3 quiet taps, the kind that said who it was without saying anything. She opened the door. "Cobb is coming Saturday," she said, keeping her voice barely above breath. Nathan nodded once. He'd been awake before she was. He'd seen the window signal. "That changes things," he said. "I know." "Is Vicar likely to be with him?" Roy didn't say, but she stopped thinking it through. If Cobb is coming to push the timeline and Vicar is his instrument, then Saturday might be when this gets forced. He said it simply, with the same steadiness that she'd come to lean on, that she refused to let herself need too much, even as she felt how much she needed it. "You have 2 days." "I know." "Then we're not waiting for my cabin as the endpoint. If Cobb comes here Saturday, I won't be here Saturday." The words came out of her fully formed, as though they'd been waiting in her chest for the right moment to become a sentence. She was surprised by them, and she wasn't. "I won't be here when Cobb comes." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running calculations, the same methodical process that had been running since the first morning he'd seen Roy's fist find her face. "Thursday night," he said. "While Roy is asleep, you take the trail, you don't come back. I have to take something with me. If I leave with nothing, take what fits in your coat pockets and nothing else. Anything else creates noise and risk." She thought about her sister's phone number, which she had memorized, the marriage certificate that had her name on it, the emergency communicator, the folding knife. "That's enough," she said. "That's everything I need." He put something in her hand. She looked down a small folded paper with a phone number on it. "My satellite phone number. My neighbor in the valley has a landline. When you're safe in my cabin, they call the county sheriff, and you have someone there who can document what happened before Roy has time to build a story. She looked at the phone number. She looked up at Nathan. There was a bruise on her cheekbone that had healed into a yellowish memory, and 2 ribs that still ached in the cold, and 2 years of a life she'd survived minute by minute on a mountain that had no pity for the unprepared. And there was this man standing in the door of her prison in the cold early morning, handing her the thread that could lead her out of it. "Thursday night," she said. "I'll walk the trail from my end at midnight. Meet you at the Flat Rock. Roy won't come after me." It wasn't a question. She was trying to believe it. "Roy will be angry," Nathan said carefully. "Roy will make calls and he'll talk to Cobb and there'll be noise. But whether Roy comes after you himself, Cobb will send Vicar." She said it before he did. Probably. He didn't sugarcoat it. "Which is why Thursday night you move and don't stop. You get to my cabin, we make the call, and we make sure you are documented and known and reported before anyone can say otherwise." She took a breath. What if Vicar is already watching Thursday night? Then I'm between him and you. He said it the way he said most things, not as bravado, not as performance, just as a fact about how he intended to arrange the physical world. "That's where I'll be." Roy's footsteps creaked across the frozen ground toward the cabin door. "Go," Emma said. Nathan was already gone before the word finished leaving her mouth. Emma turned from the north door and crossed to the stove and picked up a spoon and began stirring something that didn't need stirring. And when Roy came back inside with cold radiating off him and looked around the cabin, she was just a woman making soup, moving quietly in the space he'd made for her. Except she wasn't. She was a woman counting down to Thursday with a number in her pocket and a trail in her bones and the clearest, coldest kind of certainty she'd felt in years. She was leaving this mountain. She was not asking permission, and for the first time in 2 years that fact didn't terrify her. It steadied her. Wednesday passed like a held breath. Emma moved through the cabin with the same measured quiet she always did, cooking and cleaning and tending the fire. But underneath that familiar performance, something had shifted at the molecular level. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was preparing. The difference felt enormous, even though nothing visible had changed. Roy spent most of Wednesday on the snowmobile out along the South Ridge checking his trapline, and Emma used the hours methodically. She went through every pocket of every piece of clothing she owned and removed anything that would add weight without adding value. She memorized the phone number Nathan had given her until she could recite it backward. She checked the communicator in her waistband 3 times to confirm the battery indicator, and each time it glowed green, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it: control. She practiced the first 30 steps of the trail in her mind while she stirred a pot that didn't need stirring. She counted backward from 214. She reminded herself about the rock formation and the way the ground changed texture just before it. The slight give of frozen moss under the snow that was different from the hard pack of the open slope. She was ready. She was also scared in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. It was the fear of someone standing at the edge of an action that cannot be undone, which is a completely different animal from the fear of being hit. The fear of being hit was something that happened to her. This fear belonged to her. She'd chosen it. That made it survivable. Roy came back in the late afternoon with 2 rabbits and a mood that was quieter than usual. Not the coiled quiet. Not the aftermath quiet, but something more preoccupied, like a man running numbers in his head that weren't quite adding up. He gutted the rabbits himself, which he sometimes did, and he didn't speak much through dinner, and when he went to the lean-to after eating, Emma pressed herself to the east wall and listened. One side of a conversation fragments again, but enough. Roy's voice. "She doesn't suspect anything." A pause. "I told you Saturday, Cobb, I need..." Another pause longer. Roy again, and something different in his voice now. Something that sat between anger and fear. "What do you mean he's already there?" Emma's spine went rigid. "I didn't authorize that." Roy's voice cracking slightly at the edges. "You can't just send Vicar without telling me." The response she couldn't hear. Then, Roy very low, almost inaudible through the wall. All right. Tomorrow night then." She walked back to the stove on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Tomorrow night. Not Thursday. Tomorrow. Wednesday night. She looked at the clock on the wall. 8:43. She had at most 3 hours before Roy came back inside and went to bed, and then whatever number of hours until he was in deep sleep, and then she had to move. Not Thursday. Tonight. She had to get a signal to Nathan. The north window was dark outside, no way to know if he was at his position on the ridge. She couldn't go to the door without the risk of Roy hearing it from the lean-to. She couldn't make any sound out of the ordinary. She stood at the north window, and she looked at the red scarf on the hook by the door. The red scarf in the north window meant, "Come now." She hung it. She did it with the same motion she might use to hang anything casual, natural, the movement of a woman tidying. And then she stepped back from the window and went to the stove and put more wood on the fire and kept moving, because moving was the only thing holding the panic below the surface, where it couldn't show. 10 minutes later, Roy came inside. He looked at her. He looked around the cabin. His eyes passed over the north window without stopping. The scarf hung in the window, red against dark glass. "Going to bed early," he said. "Long day." "I'll be up a little while longer. Fire needs watching." He grunted and went to the sleeping loft. She heard the weight of him settle into the bed, the creak of the frame, and then the particular quality of silence that meant he was lying there and not yet asleep. She sat by the stove and watched the fire and waited. 40 minutes. That was usually how long it took him to reach the deep stage, the stage where she could move through the cabin without risk of waking him. Tonight she gave him 50. 50 minutes of sitting at the stove with her hands loose in her lap and her breathing even and her mind running through everything she needed and everything she could not forget. Marriage certificate under the loose board. She needed that. Evidence of who she was and what she'd been living. The communicator. Already on her person. The folding knife. Already on her person. Nathan's number. Already memorized and written on the paper in her coat pocket. Her sister's number. Memorized 7 years ago and never lost. At 9:50 she went to the sleeping loft stairs and stood at the bottom and listened. Roy's breathing had the slow submarine quality of deep sleep. She gave it another 2 minutes counting in her head. Then she moved. She crossed to the northeast corner of the loft with footsteps so careful they made no sound she could detect, and she worked the loose board free with the patience of a woman who'd done this before. The communicator. The original one she slipped into her left coat pocket to back up the one in her waistband. The marriage certificate folded small. She hesitated over Nathan's map. Took it. She descended the stairs one at a time, placing her foot on the outer edge of each step where the wood was least likely to speak. She reached the bottom. She put on her coat and her heaviest gloves. She looked at the room, the stove, the table, the things that had been her prison for 2 years, and she felt nothing romantic about leaving them. She felt only the clean, forward-facing urgency of a woman with somewhere better to be. She opened the north door. The cold hit her like a solid thing. The temperature having dropped 10 degrees since dark, and her first breath of it was a shock she absorbed without making a sound. She pulled the door closed behind her, not latched, just resting in the frame, because the sound of the latch might carry, and turned north. 20 steps to the edge of the property. Then the tree cover began. She was at 15 when a hand closed around her arm from behind. She had the knife out and spun before the scream could form, and Nathan caught her wrist. Both hands, her knife hand in one, and her other arm in the other, and said her name barely audible, just the sound of it. She went still. Her heart was slamming. He released her wrists immediately. "I saw the scarf. What happened?" She kept her voice at nothing. "Tonight. Not Thursday. Roy talked to Cobb. Vicar is already here somewhere, I don't know where. They moved it to tomorrow night, but Roy doesn't know I heard." His face in the dark was unreadable in the way that all faces are in real darkness, but she could feel him processing the same rapid internal motion underneath the surface stillness. "Can you run?" he said. "Yes." "Then we go now. Same trail, no lantern. You stay on my left, 1 arm's length behind. If I stop, you stop. If I drop, you drop, and don't make a sound." "Vicar." "I know. That's why we go fast." His hand found her left shoulder, not grabbing, just orienting. Ready? Yes. They went. The trail in the dark without the lantern was a different thing entirely. Her body knowledge of it held for the first section. The split spruce, the 40 yards of open ground, the tree line, but past that, the darkness was total enough that she was running almost entirely on what she'd committed to her bones during the practice walk. The ground texture, the slope of the terrain, the way the wind changed direction as the ridge curved north. Nathan moved ahead of her without sound, and she followed the slight displacement of air that his body made and kept one hand up to avoid branches and counted steps when the count still made sense, and let the count go when the terrain demanded something more instinctive. They were 50 yards into the trees when Nathan stopped so suddenly that she nearly walked into him. She stopped. She stopped breathing. He stood absolutely motionless for 6 seconds. Then he turned his head slightly to the right, and she understood he was locating a sound she hadn't caught yet. She filtered out her own heartbeat and the wind and the snow settling in branches and reached for the noise underneath all of that. Footsteps. Not close. Maybe 100 yards east moving south. Moving parallel to the trail, but not on it. Vicar. Howe was making a circuit of the cabin perimeter, coming from the east side and heading south, the wrong direction. He was looking for movement on the obvious side, the access road side, which was exactly what Roy would have told him to watch. He wasn't watching the north. Roy hadn't told Cobb about the north trail, which meant Roy didn't know about it. Nathan waited until the footsteps faded past the edge of hearing. Then he touched her shoulder once forward, and they moved again faster now, and Emma kept pace and didn't let herself think about how close that had been, or what would have happened if Vicar had been making his circuit 5 minutes earlier. She thought instead about 214 steps and the flat table rock and her sister's phone number. She thought about 14 good years. They reached the rock formation 22 minutes after leaving the cabin. Nathan stopped there and crouched behind the flat rock, and she crouched beside him, and they both breathed for 30 seconds without speaking, which was all the rest either of them was going to allow. "We're halfway," he said, mouth close to her ear. "The back half is uphill and slower. You still with me?" "Yes." "The cold getting to you?" She took stock. Fingers stiff, despite the gloves, toes losing sensation in her boots, but nothing approaching dangerous. "I'm fine. Let's go." He looked at her for a moment in a way that she felt rather than saw. Then he stood and they went on. The second half of the trail was harder, steeper, and less forgiving, and in 2 places she went down on one knee in the snow and came back up without losing more than a second each time. Nathan didn't reach for her. He'd learned somehow already that she didn't want the help that communicated doubt. He simply maintained pace and let her catch it. When she saw the orange glow of his cabin window through the trees ahead, something released in her chest that she'd been holding for so long she hadn't known it was held. A sound escaped her, just one small and involuntary, and she was grateful for the dark and the wind that swallowed it. He pushed the cabin door open, and she went inside and stood in the warmth of his wood stove and let it hit her for exactly 30 seconds. That was all. Then she turned around. "The satellite phone," she said. He had it out already. The call to the county sheriff's office took 6 minutes. Emma spoke clearly and without rushing, and she told the dispatcher her name and her location as Nathan described it to her in a low voice, and she said that she had left a dangerous situation and that she had reason to believe individuals affiliated with a man named Cobb were in the area with intent she believed to be criminal, and that her husband, Roy Carter, might file a report claiming she was missing or unstable, and she was asking that her account be documented before any counter-narrative was submitted. The dispatcher, a woman with a flat professional voice, who clearly was not new to this kind of call, asked Emma to confirm the address and her identity, and said she was logging it with a timestamp and asking the on-call deputy to note it as a priority. "Is there someone who can come to your location tonight?" the dispatcher asked. Emma looked at Nathan. He said quietly, "Not tonight. Road's not passable until morning light. I can get them to the Valley Road." "Tomorrow morning," Emma said into the phone. "We can be at the Valley Road junction by 7. "I'll have someone there," the dispatcher said. What's the junction reference? Nathan gave her the mile marker. When the call ended, Emma set the phone down on Nathan's table and stood there and understood that she had just done the thing that could not be undone. She had named herself to a government record. She had placed her physical location on a timestamp. She had set in motion something that could not stop, and Cobb could not reinterpret, and Pete Gruber could not drive her away from. She'd built a wall of documentation around herself before anyone could tell a different story. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed them start. Nathan set a cup of something hot in front of her tea from the smell of it, and she wrapped both hands around it, and the shaking slowed. You did that well, he said. I've been rehearsing it for about 6 months. She hadn't known that was true until she said it. He sat down across from her. The wood stove was between them, and the warmth of it was extraordinary, the kind of warmth that goes through layers rather than just sitting on the surface, and Emma thought distantly that she hadn't been this warm since September. Roy's going to find the cabin empty before morning, she said. Yes. He'll call Cobb first, not the sheriff. That's my read too. And Cobb will send Vicar to look for me. Vicar knows this ridge, he's been walking it. He knows the lower ridge, Nathan said. He doesn't know this side of the tree line, and he doesn't know I'm here. She absorbed that. He'll figure it out. By morning, yes, which is why 7 at the Valley Road is the number. We have roughly 4 hours before Roy wakes to an empty bed, maybe another hour before he's made calls, and Vicar is in motion. We have time. Emma drank the tea. She held on to the cup. Outside, the wind was doing something dramatic against the north wall of the cabin, the kind of sustained howling that in another circumstance might have been frightening, and tonight just sounded like weather. Nathan. She said his name, and then wasn't sure what she intended to attach to it. He waited. Thank you, she said finally, which felt insufficient. It felt like trying to contain a river in a coffee cup. But it was what she had. He looked at her across the table with those steady dark eyes that had been watching out for her from the tree line for weeks, and what she saw in them was not what she expected and not what she was ready for. It wasn't satisfaction, and it wasn't relief, and it wasn't the particular expression of a man who's done a good thing and knows it. It was something that looked quietly and without announcement, like hope. You did the hard part, he said. Every hard part. I just walked you to a door you'd already decided to walk through. She looked down at the cup. Get some sleep, he said, standing. I'll keep watch until 4 and then wake you. We need to be moving by 5 to make the Valley Road by 7 with margin. She started to say she wouldn't sleep, that there was no sleeping after what the last 3 hours had been, and then she was lying on the cot he'd set up for her with a wool blanket pulled to her chin, and she was gone before the thought finished. She woke at 4 to Nathan's hand on her shoulder. One touch immediate, and she was sitting up before she was fully conscious, which told her something about what 2 years on Roy's Mountain had done to her nervous system. Quiet so far, he said. No lights on the lower ridge. Roy doesn't panic fast. He'd be angry first. Then we have our window. He handed her a thermos and something wrapped in cloth food from the density of it. Eat while we move. I want to be off my property before first light. She ate standing up, pulling on her outer layers. The food was dried meat and something dense and sweet that she didn't identify, but that hit her bloodstream like fuel, which was exactly what it was meant to do. We take a different route out, Nathan said, tying his own coat. Not the trail we came in on. I'm going to bring us west along the ridge and down the back of it to the Valley Road from the opposite direction. It adds 20 minutes, but it keeps us away from the access road entirely. In case Vicar's watching the access road. In case Vicar's watching the access road. She nodded. Lead. They went out the door into the dark, and the cold was even harder than the night before. Something in the temperature, having dropped in the pre-dawn hours, in the way mountain temperatures do, brutal and unsentimental. She breathed through her nose and kept pace, and tracked the terrain by feel, and by the particular way Nathan's body moved through it, which she'd been learning to read the way you learn to read any landscape you depend on. They were 40 minutes into the walk off Nathan's property, and moving down the western face of the ridge when they heard the snowmobile. Both of them stopped simultaneously. The engine sound was coming from below, from the direction of the access road, which meant someone was on Roy's road heading up the mountain. At this hour. Moving fast. Not Roy, Nathan said quietly. Roy's snowmobile has a different pitch, I know it. That's a different machine. Vicar. Moving up, not across. He's going to the cabin first. Emma calculated. The cabin was empty. Vicar would arrive at the cabin, find it empty, begin searching the property. When he didn't find her on the property, he'd expand outward. The most logical direction from the cabin was south toward the access road. That was the direction anyone leaving on foot would take. He'd waste time on the south side before he thought to look north. How long? She said. 15 minutes before he knows the cabin is empty. Another 10 before he's ruled out the south side. After that, Nathan's jaw set. We push harder. Come on. They moved faster, and the terrain was steeper. Here the western face more demanding than the north trail had been. She pushed herself past the point of comfort and kept pushing, and Nathan matched her pace without comment. And below them, the snowmobile's engine cut off, and the sudden silence was somehow louder than the sound had been. Vicar was at the cabin. She counted seconds. She breathed. She moved. They were another 20 minutes down the western face when Nathan stopped again, and she nearly walked into him and caught herself, and then heard what he'd heard. A second engine. Somewhere north. Not the same machine as before. Higher pitched, lighter. Coming from the direction of Nathan's property line. She turned to him. His face was doing the thing it did when he was processing fast, and she watched the calculation move through him and arrive. Cobb sent 2 people, he said. She understood the architecture of it immediately. Vicar to the cabin. Someone else to come at the ridge from the north. Whoever that second person was, they were either guessing she'd gone north or they'd found the trail somehow, and either way, they're running a pinch, she said. Nathan looked at her, a quick, sharp look that said yes, exactly that. South was the access road and Vicar. North was the ridge, and whoever was coming from that direction. They were on the western face, which was the only direction neither of Cobb's people was currently covering, and the Valley Road junction was west and south, which meant they had to get down this face and turn south and reach the junction before either of Cobb's people cut across to intercept. How far are we from the Valley Road? She said. A mile, 20 minutes at a walk, 12 if we run. Then we run. He looked at her. He looked at the terrain below them. She couldn't see it clearly, but she could see him assessing it. It's rough on this face, he said. I know. If you go down in the wrong place. Nathan. Her voice was sharp and clean. I've been walking this mountain for 2 years and I have 14 minutes. Let's go. Something crossed his face that she'd have given a lot to understand fully and didn't have time to consider. He turned downhill. They ran. Running down the western face of that ridge in the dark was the most purely physical thing Emma Carter had ever done. The terrain gave no latitude for mistakes, rocks under the snow, sudden drops in grade, places where the ice was underneath the powder, and her feet would go out without warning, and she went down twice and came back up both times with the automatic violence of a body that had decided it was not stopping. And Nathan was 3 steps ahead, always not pulling her, not waiting, just holding pace and letting her match it. She matched it. Her lungs were burning, and her left knee had caught something hard on the second fall and was radiating pain with each step, and she cataloged it and dismissed it and kept moving, because pain was information, not instruction. 8 minutes down the western face. Nathan caught her arm, not hard a touch, and pulled them both behind a stand of trees, and they pressed into the cover and went completely still. 40 yards ahead, on what she now understood was the valley floor, a figure was moving east. Dark coat moving deliberately, carrying something. Not a snowmobile. On foot. Coming from the south. Vicar hadn't stayed at the cabin. He'd come around the bottom of the ridge on foot and was sweeping west, which meant he'd been faster and smarter than she'd given him credit for, or he'd been given instructions that anticipated this route. Cobb had thought about this. This wasn't improvised. Nathan's mouth was at her ear. He doesn't see us. But he's going to cross the Valley Road junction in about 3 minutes if we don't. Can we get to the junction before him? Not directly. A pause. She could feel him thinking. There's a creek crossing 40 yards west of his current position. He doesn't know about it. It's not on any map I've seen. But it means going through knee-deep frozen water in the dark. She looked at him. Say yes or no, she said. I can do whatever comes after either one. Yes, he said. Come on. The creek was exactly where he said it was. She heard it before she saw it. The particular sound of water still moving under ice at the edges, cold enough to be nearly solid, but not quite. Nathan went in first, and the sound he made when it hit him was involuntary and human, and she almost loved him for making it, because it meant the cold got to him too. She went in behind him. The cold was extraordinary. It entered through her boots, immediately found every nerve ending in her feet and ankles, and made them all scream simultaneously, and she made no sound. She could prevent and moved, because stopping was not an option. 12 steps. 15. The far bank which Nathan reached first, and then turned and gripped her forearm, not hauling, stabilizing while she climbed out. She looked down at her boots, already freezing. Her feet were going from pain to the dangerous numbness stage. Valley Road, he said. 100 yards. You can lose your feet to cold in 15 minutes of standing still. You cannot stop moving. She was already moving. The 100 yards to the Valley Road felt longer than the entire descent of the ridge. Her feet were increasingly unreliable as the cold set into them, and she ran on sensation she was losing, and counted steps because the count was something her mind could hold on to when her body was giving her unreliable data. The Valley Road materialized in the gray pre-dawn light gravel showing through snow, the particular flatness of a maintained surface under winter accumulation. And Nathan stopped her at the edge of the tree line and held her there with one hand while he looked in both directions. I don't see Vicar on the road. The creek bought us time. He would have had to go around. Yes. He scanned again. 7 a.m. was the deputy's time. What's the hour? She had no watch. He did. He looked at it. 6:42. 18 minutes. They came out of the tree line and moved along the road shoulder, staying close to the tree line, rather than center of road, and Emma concentrated on generating enough motion to push blood into her feet. She could feel them again barely and painfully, which she chose to interpret as good news. At 53, a truck appeared at the south end of the road. A county truck moving north, and when Nathan stepped out onto the road surface and raised one arm, it slowed and stopped. The deputy who got out was a woman Emma had never seen, maybe 40, with the kind of face that processed information quickly and without editorializing. She looked at Emma. She looked at Nathan. She looked at Emma's face, which was what everyone looked at first and always, and what she saw there was apparently sufficient because her first words were not a question. Emma Carter. Yes, I have a timestamp log from last night's call. You're documented. Before you say anything else. She reached into her truck and produced a camera. Let me take pictures of visible injuries. Emma stood in the pre-dawn cold on the Valley Road and let the deputy do her job. And while she was doing it, she heard a snowmobile engine somewhere in the distance on the ridge, moving without direction, searching. Too late. She was documented and witnessed and named and known, and the deputy was writing everything down in a notebook with the focused efficiency of a woman who understood that paperwork was its own kind of armor. She heard another sound, then closer from the tree line 40 yards north. Vicar came out of the trees. How was a large man younger than she'd imagined, and he stopped when he saw the county truck and the deputy and the camera and the calculation. She watched move across his face was not subtle. He'd been sent to collect a problem and collect it quietly. And what he'd found instead was an official county record in progress and 2 witnesses and a timestamp. The deputy looked at him. She didn't reach for anything. She simply looked at him the way law enforcement looks at a person who has just appeared out of the tree line at 7 in the morning in conditions that warrant explanation. You got business on this road, she said. Vicar looked at Emma. His expression was not the face of a man defeated not yet, but it was the face of a man who had just understood that the job had changed fundamentally, and he needed to make a phone call before he did anything else. Just hiking, he said. Uh-huh. The deputy wrote something in her notebook. Name, a long pause. Phil Vicar. She wrote it down. Address, High gave a valley address. She wrote that too. You're going to want to stay accessible over the next day or two. Mr. Vicker, investigating officer may have questions. Vicker looked at Emma one more time. What passed between them in that look was not a threat exactly. He was too careful for that in front of a witness with a notepad. It was something more like an acknowledgement. He'd found her, and she'd been found in a way that removed his options, and he knew it, and she knew it, and the deputy knew it, and all three of them understood the conversation was over before it had technically begun. He turned and walked back into the tree line. Emma exhaled. Nathan was standing slightly behind her right shoulder in the position he'd occupied throughout present available, not in front of her. Not between her and the world. Beside her. The deputy looked at Emma with the kind of direct professionalism that Emma had spent 2 years almost forgetting existed. We're going to need a full statement. There's a warming room at the station. You want to call anyone first? Emma thought about her sister in Billings. About a phone that hadn't been smashed. About 4 months of silence that was about to end. Yes, she said. I want to call my sister. The deputy opened the truck door for her, and Emma Carter got in, and the door closed, and the valley road stretched south toward town through the winter morning, and she was in a vehicle she had chosen to enter, going somewhere she had chosen to go with the ability to change her mind about any of it. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the truck window and looked up at the ridge. Somewhere up there, Roy was awake and angry and talking to Cobb and discovering the hard way what it meant when a woman you'd underestimated had spent 3 weeks learning the terrain and making plans. She was not invisible. She was not unstable. She was not Pete Gruber's problem to drive home. She was Emma Carter, and she had walked 2 miles in the dark through a frozen creek and beaten Vicker to a road, and she was going to call her sister, and then she was going to tell the truth to anyone who would write it down. She was done surviving. She had decided somewhere in the dark on the western face of that ridge that she intended to live, and that intention, it turned out, was the hardest and most necessary thing she had ever built. The warming room at the county sheriff's station was exactly what it sounded like. A small room with a space heater running at full capacity, and 2 chairs and a table with a box of tissues on it that Emma did not touch. The deputy, whose name she'd learned was Sandra Oakes, brought her a pair of dry socks from somewhere in the back, and a cup of coffee that was terrible and perfect, and Emma changed her socks at the table with the focused practicality of a woman who'd learned that taking care of the body was the first obligation of survival, and then she held the coffee cup and waited. Deputy Oakes came back with a notepad and a digital recorder, and she set them both on the table and looked at Emma with the kind of directness that bypassed pity and landed somewhere more useful. You want to call your sister before we start? After, Emma said. I want to give you the statement while it's clean, before anything else gets into it. Oakes looked at her. You've thought about this. For a long time, all right. Oakes clicked on the recorder. Take me back to the beginning. Emma took a breath and began. She talked for 47 minutes. She started with the move to the mountain and the first time Roy hit her, and she went through it systematically, without embellishment, without the kind of emotional performance that she knew made people uncomfortable, and sometimes made them disbelieve. She had dates where she had them, and approximate dates where she didn't. She described the phone being smashed, and Pete Gruber driving her home, and the CB radio in the lean-to, and the conversations she'd heard through the wall. She described Vicker walking the perimeter of the cabin at night. She described the water rights and the spring on the northeast corner of the property, and what Roy had said about leverage over the downstream properties. When she got to Nathan, she was careful and precise. She described him as a neighbor who'd provided assistance, gave his full name and property location, and described specifically what he'd done. The food, the communicator, the map, walking the trail with her in the dark. She described it in terms that made clear both the nature of the help and the fact that nothing about it had been coerced or manipulative or anything other than what it appeared to be. Oakes wrote and recorded and asked 3 clarifying questions in 47 minutes. All of them practical, and none of them the kind that implied doubt. When Emma stopped talking, the deputy looked at her notepad for a moment, then up. The spring, Oakes said. The water rights on the northeast corner. You said Roy talked about leverage over downstream properties. Did he name the downstream owners? No. Alderson family ring a bell. Emma looked at her. Nathan mentioned that name. He said they'd had water disputes with various parties in this valley. Oakes wrote something. Cobb has been on our radar for 2 years in connection with a water rights interference case. The Aldersons filed a complaint in the spring. We haven't had enough to move on him. She said it in the tone of someone sharing information that the other person has a right to know. What you've described Roy's arrangement, the timeline Vickers movements, that's evidence in something larger than a domestic violence case. Emma absorbed that. How much larger? Larger enough that I'm going to make 2 more phone calls before you leave this building. Oakes clicked off the recorder. Which means what you've given me today matters in ways that go beyond your situation. I want you to understand that. What I understand, Emma said carefully, is that I have a documented statement with a timestamp that was filed before Roy made any counterclaims. Whatever else this is, that's what I need. Oakes looked at her with something that was close to approval. You're right, and you have it. She stood. Use that phone. Call your sister. I'll be back in 20 minutes. Her sister's name was Carol, and she answered on the second ring, despite it being not yet 8 in the morning. And when Emma said, "It's me," the silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds before Carol made a sound that was not a word, but was the most articulate thing Emma had ever heard. Emma, where are you? I haven't, it's been 4 months. I know, I'm okay. I'm at the county sheriff's station. She heard Carol's breath catch. I'm okay, she said again more firmly. I got out, I'm okay. The conversation that followed was not tidy. Carol cried, which made Emma's chest ache in the particular way of someone who has held themselves together for a long time and is now in the presence of someone who loves them. Emma didn't cry. Not yet. She stayed in the practical register because the practical register was what was holding her together, and she needed it for a while longer. She told Carol enough to land the important facts she'd left Roy. She was safe. She had a statement on file. She needed a few days before she could talk about all of it. Carol, to her tremendous credit, heard the request underneath those words and honored it. Are you coming here? Carol asked. To Billings. Emma thought about that. She thought about Nathan's cabin 2 miles up the mountain. She thought about the trail she knew by body memory now in the dark through a frozen creek. Not immediately, she said. I need to deal with some things here first. What things? Legal things. And, she paused. There's someone who helped me. I don't want to leave without... She stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish that sentence in a way that was accurate and didn't sound like something Carol would immediately have opinions about. What kind of someone? Carol said. The useful kind, Emma said. I'll explain later. Carol let it go, which was another reason Emma loved her. After she hung up, she sat in the small warm room and let herself be still for 30 seconds. Just 30. She could hear activity in the rest of the building voices' phones, the mundane machinery of a working office, and all of it sounded extraordinarily ordinary, and she wanted to sit in it forever. She gave herself 30 seconds, and then she straightened and picked up the coffee cup, and she was ready when Oakes came back. The 2 phone calls Oakes had made were to a detective in the State Division of Criminal Investigation and to the county prosecutor's office. Emma knew this because Oakes told her directly, which was the approach Emma had already identified as the deputy's consistent mode: direct information, no management of reaction. The DCI detective wants to interview you, Oakes said. Not today. He can be here by tomorrow afternoon. You don't have to agree to that. I agree to it. You'll want a lawyer present. I know. Carol's husband is an attorney. Not criminal law, but he'll know who to call. She'd already thought of this on the phone with Carol had already asked, and Carol had already said she'd have a name within the hour. Oakes nodded. In the meantime, where are you sleeping tonight? Emma had been thinking about this since the truck. The station wasn't an option for more than a few hours. A shelter in town was an option, but required navigating an unfamiliar system in a condition she wasn't ready to call crisis because it didn't feel like crisis. It felt like aftermath. Nathan's cabin was 2 miles up a mountain she'd just descended in the dark, and that was not a reasonable suggestion. Is there a motel in town? The Riverside. It's decent. We have a relationship with the owner. She's housed women in situations before she's discreet. And if you tell her Sandra Oaks sent you, she'll give you a room at a rate that accounts for circumstances. Emma thought about money. She had $11 and a marriage certificate. I don't have. There's a county fund for emergency housing. 48 hours, no questions. After that, we connect you with the advocate office. Oaks wrote an address on a card and handed it across. You're not the first person to come off that mountain with nothing in her pockets. Emma took the card. She looked at it. I have a marriage certificate, she said, and documented water rights information that connects to a larger criminal investigation. Is there a way to use any of that? Oaks almost smiled. You're thinking about the property. It's in both our names. Roy's name is on the deed, but the marriage gives me a legal interest. And if the water rights are evidence in a criminal case, that's for the prosecutor and your attorney to work out. But yes. Oaks held her gaze. You're not without leverage here. You didn't leave with nothing. Emma sat with that for a moment. She hadn't thought of it in those terms. She'd thought of leaving as the only goal, and leaving had occupied her entire mental horizon for so long that she hadn't yet turned to look at what leaving made possible. She had evidence. She had documentation. She had a legal interest in a property that sat above a spring that connected to a criminal investigation. She had a sister in Billings with an attorney in the family, and 47 minutes of recorded statement with a pre-dawn timestamp. Roy had told Cobb she was unstable and prone to stories. Roy had made a significant miscalculation. Nathan arrived at the station at 9:45. She knew it was him before she saw him because she heard his voice at the front desk, that particular low, unhurried register, and the sound of it did something to her nervous system that she was not prepared to analyze right now. She heard him say her name as a question, and Oaks's voice responding, and then the door to the warming room opened. He looked at her, the way he'd looked at her through the north window of the cabin, the first time their eyes met across a distance, assessing direct without theater. You all right? Yes. She meant it. He came in and sat down, and she noticed for the first time that he looked tired in a way he hadn't let her see before. The 11-year mountain self-sufficiency was intact, but underneath it there were lines that hadn't been visible in the dark, and they told her that he'd been awake since she'd left his cabin, which meant he hadn't slept. Roy filed a missing person report at 7:15, he said. She'd expected this. Of course he did. The deputy at the desk told me it was flagged immediately against your prior statement. Oaks had already entered it into the system before Roy's call came in. He said it with a quiet satisfaction. The story he tried to tell arrived 8 minutes after yours was already on record. 8 minutes. 8 minutes that could have been everything. Vicar, she said, drove out of the valley about an hour ago, heading south. He paused. Cobb's place is dark. I drove past on the way here. He's pulling back. For now, he's not stupid. He knows the case is changing shape, and he's going to wait for Roy to absorb the first impact before he decides how to position himself. Nathan's voice was even, but the look in his eyes was the look of a man who'd spent 11 years watching how things moved on that mountain and was very good at predicting the next motion. Roy's going to try to reclaim the narrative. He'll lean on the unstable story, try to get people who know you, who think they know you, to corroborate. Pete Gruber, Emma said. Pete Gruber will say what Roy tells him to say, yes. It won't matter, Emma said. Not against a timestamp. Nathan looked at her across the table. No, he said. It won't. There was a pause between them. Then, not uncomfortable, not charged with anything that needed to be named, just the pause of two people who had been through something fast and serious together, and were now sitting in a room that was warm and safe, and that neither of them had been certain they'd reach. I need to ask you something, Emma said. Ask. The DCI detective comes tomorrow. He'll want to talk to you too. Your 11 years on that mountain, what you've seen moving through those corridors, what you know about Cobb's operations. She looked at him carefully. That's going to open things up for you, not just being a witness in my case, in whatever the larger case turns out to be. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. It changes things for you. For your situation on the mountain. It does. She waited. He leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the table, and he looked at her with the same steadiness that had been the foundation of everything she'd built in the last 3 weeks. Emma, I've been watching what Cobb does to this valley for a long time. I've made choices about not getting involved that I'm not proud of, and I've told myself they were pragmatic, and they were partly true, and they were partly easier. He stopped. You didn't get easy. You got out anyway. She understood what he was saying and what it cost him to say it. All right, she said. I'll talk to the detective. Good. She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty. She set it back down. There's something else. Say it. The property, the cabin, Roy's water rights. She'd been working through this since the warming room. If the criminal investigation advances and Cobb's involvement with the water rights is established, the property becomes evidence. Roy's legal position weakens. My interest in the property as his spouse becomes something. Yes, I don't want that cabin, she said. I want to be clear. I have no desire to go back to that specific structure. But the land, the spring, the water rights. She met his eyes. There are downstream families who've been dealing with this for years. If I have any legal standing in this property, I want to use it to make sure Cobb never gets what he was building toward. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. You walked 2 miles in the dark through a frozen creek 6 hours ago, he said, and I'm already thinking about next steps. Yes. She didn't apologize for it. He exhaled something that wasn't quite a laugh, but was close to it, close enough that it was the first real warmth she'd heard from him. The first crack in the mountain's solid composure, and it hit her somewhere she wasn't expecting. The Alderson family, he said. 4 generations on that land. They've been fighting this for 30 years. You want to talk to them. I want my attorney to talk to them. Carol's husband is making calls this morning. She paused. But yes, I want the right people to have the right information. He nodded slowly. I can get you a number for the Alderson family. That would help. He pulled out a worn leather notebook from his coat pocket. Physical hand, written the analog system of a man who'd spent 11 years in the mountains without reliable digital anything. And he found the page and wrote a number on a piece of paper and slid it across the table. She took it and added it to the growing collection of numbers in her pocket. You should know, he said, that Roy knows you came to me. He'll have figured it out by now, the direction, the trail, all of it. He's going to tell people I was involved in something inappropriate. He's going to try to use it. Emma looked at him. She thought about Roy's system, the way he'd built the unstable story, the way he'd cultivated Pete Gruber, the way he'd laid groundwork. Roy's greatest skill had always been making a story before she could. He can try, she said. He's 8 minutes too late for it to matter. Something settled in Nathan's expression. She couldn't have named it precisely. Certainty, maybe. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Where are you staying? He said. The riverside. Oaks arranged it. Good. The owner there. Sandra said she's housed women in situations before. She has. Her daughter. He said it quietly without elaboration, and Emma didn't push. I'm talking to the DCI detective tomorrow afternoon, Emma said. My attorney, Carol's husband's referral, should be here by noon. I'll come at 2 if that works. That works. He started to rise and she said, Nathan. He stopped. She'd been thinking since the truck about what you said to a man who walked you out of a prison in the dark. She'd been thinking about how you accounted for that in any system of measurement she'd been taught to use. Thank you was insufficient, and she'd already said it, and it hadn't fit then either. The 14 years, she said, that your mother got. He looked at her and didn't speak. I think I understand now, she said, why you kept watch from that ridge. His face did the thing it had done across the table in his cabin. That quiet thing she hadn't been ready for and wasn't entirely ready for. Now, the thing that looked like hope, but was older than hope, was the thing that survives hope, when hope has been a long time tested. Get some sleep, he said. You too, she said. You haven't. He left, and Deputy Oakes drove Emma to the riverside, and the owner, a woman in her 60s named Grace with efficient hands and a face that processed without commentary, gave Emma a room on the second floor, with a window that faced east, and a lock that worked, and a bathroom with hot water that ran immediately. Emma stood under the hot water for 12 minutes. She stood there until her feet fully thawed, and the frozen creek was out of her bones, and the 2-year cold of Roy's cabin had retreated to somewhere she could deal with later. She stood there until she was just a person in a warm room, clean alone by choice, with no one whose mood she needed to manage. Then she got out and dried off, and lay down on a bed that was hers for 48 hours. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She woke at 2 in the afternoon to a text from Carol. Carol's husband had a name and a number for a criminal defense and family law attorney in Missoula who could be in town by tomorrow morning. Emma read it twice and wrote back, "Perfect, thank you." She lay there for another minute, looking at the ceiling of a room that smelled like clean linen and not like wood smoke, and Roy's particular brand of anger, and she thought about everything that needed to happen and the order in which it needed to happen. And when she was done thinking about it, she got up. She found her boots dry by the heater where she'd left them, and she put them on and went downstairs and asked Grace if there was anywhere to eat in walking distance. And Grace pointed her toward a diner 2 blocks south that served breakfast all day. Emma walked 2 blocks in winter afternoon light alone, unhurried in a direction she had chosen, and sat at the diner counter and ordered eggs and coffee, and ate without having to manage anyone's mood or measure her words or track the sound of a truck on a mountain road. The waitress asked if she wanted more coffee, and Emma said yes, and the waitress filled her cup, and that was the entire transaction, complete and simple, and Emma sat with it for a moment and felt the specific weight of what it meant to do ordinary things in ordinary safety. She was on her second cup when her phone, the station phone that Oakes had let her use to set up a temporary number forwarded from Carol's account, buzzed with a call she didn't recognize. She answered it. Roy's voice came through the line like a thing she'd been expecting and hadn't. Emma. Not angry. Careful. The aftermath quiet voice, the version that came after destruction and offered reconstruction. She knew it completely. I know where you are. I'm not calling to make trouble. I just want to talk. She let the silence sit for 3 seconds. Roy, she said, just hear me out. Whatever you think you know about Cobb about the water rights, you've got it wrong. It wasn't what it looked like. I was trying to protect us. I was trying to build something. Roy. Her voice was not unkind. It was not kind either. It was simply clear. I have a recorded statement filed at 6:49 this morning. I have photographs of visible injuries. I have a witness to events on the property going back 3 weeks. I have documented evidence of CB radio communications that reference a timeline and named parties. She paused. And in approximately 20 hours, I am going to sit across from a DCI detective and add to all of that. Silence. You should talk to an attorney, she said. Today, not tomorrow, today. More silence. Then Roy's voice stripped now of the careful management, something cracking underneath it. Emma, you don't understand what Cobb will do if... That is not my problem. He'll come after... Roy. She said it once flat and final. Get a lawyer. She ended the call. She set the phone on the counter and picked up her coffee cup, and her hands were not shaking. She registered this with something close to wonder. Roy's voice. Roy's carefully reconstructed need. The architecture of dependence and guilt that he'd spent 2 years building, and her hands were not shaking. She drank her coffee. When she got back to the riverside, Grace was behind the desk and looked up with the kind of quiet attentiveness that said she'd probably read the situation accurately from the beginning. Someone called here for you, Grace said. Man named Harrison, left his number. Emma took the slip of paper even though she already had the number. He said to tell you Cobb's vehicle was seen leaving the county around noon. Grace held her gaze. He said you'd know what that meant. Cobb running. The criminal investigation becoming visible enough that Cobb had calculated the exposure and decided to reduce his proximity to it, which meant Roy was being left without his primary asset and without the cover that Cobb's network had provided. Roy alone was considerably less dangerous than Roy plus Cobb. "I know what it means," Emma said. She went upstairs and sat on her bed and called Nathan's number, and he picked up on the second ring. "Cobb's gone," she said. "Yes, his property is locked up. He didn't take everything too fast for a permanent move, but he's not in the county." Nathan's voice had the quality of someone who'd been watching and waiting and processing for hours. "Roy is at the cabin alone. His truck hasn't moved since this morning. He called me." A pause. "What did he say?" "He tried the reasonable version first. When that didn't work, he tried the danger version, warning me about what Cobb would do." She paused. "I told him to get a lawyer." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "How did it feel?" he said. It was not the question she'd expected. She thought about it honestly. "Like closing a door," she said. "Not slamming it, just closing it. That's the right sound for it." She looked out the east window of her room. Late afternoon light already going pale. The mountains were visible on the horizon from this angle. The ridge, the western face, the terrain she'd run through in the dark with her feet going numb, and her knee hurting, and her lungs burning. "Nathan," she said, "when the DCI interview is done, when the attorney's been and the statement is complete, and Roy has had time to understand what his options actually are." She stopped. "I'd like to come back up the mountain." The silence on the other end was the kind she'd learned to read, not absence, but presence. Consideration. "For what purpose?" he said. Not a challenge, a genuine question. "I want to see it differently," she said. "The mountain. I want to walk that trail in daylight and see what I was walking through. I've only ever seen it in the dark." "That's a reasonable thing to want. And I want to see your cabin when I'm not running from something." Another pause, longer this time. "When you're ready," he said. "A few days. I'll be there." She stayed on the phone for another minute, not saying much, just existing in the same space across the miles. And then she said goodnight, and set the phone down, and sat in the fading light of her second hour of real freedom. Tomorrow, there would be an attorney and a DCI detective, and statements that built on statements. There would be Roy's attorney doing whatever Roy's attorney would do, and Cobb's absence creating a new kind of legal geometry, and the Alderson family, and their 30 years of water disputes, and what Emma's interest in that spring might mean for their future. There was a great deal of work ahead. She understood that clearly. But tonight, she was in a locked room she had chosen in a bed that was hers, with the mountain visible on the horizon, and a phone number in her pocket, and the knowledge bone. Deep trail deep, frozen, creek deep, that she was not the woman Roy Carter had tried to make her into. She was Emma Carter. She had walked out. And tomorrow, she was going to walk forward, and she did one day at a time, one hard thing at a time, until the days accumulated into something she recognized as a life she had chosen. The attorney Carol's husband found was a woman named Patricia Hess, and she arrived at the riverside at 8:50 the next morning with a leather briefcase and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the kind of focused energy that communicated immediately that she charged well and earned it. She shook Emma's hand without preamble, sat down, opened a notepad and said, "Tell me everything in the order it happened. Don't edit for what you think matters. I'll decide what matters." Emma told her everything. Again. The third full telling in 24 hours, and this time she noticed something. It was getting cleaner each time. Not smaller, not less painful, but cleaner. The way a wound looks different once it's been properly dressed. The facts were becoming just facts, which was not the same as them not mattering. It was the same as them becoming workable material instead of the walls of a room she was still locked inside. Patricia took 12 pages of notes and asked 21 questions. Emma counted, and when she was done, she set down her pen and looked at Emma over her reading glasses. "The water rights documentation is going to be the spine of this," she said. "Roy's name is on the deed, but Montana is an equitable distribution state, and you have a spousal interest in that property. Combined with the criminal investigation into Cobb's operations and Roy's documented participation in the arrangement." She paused. "Roy Carter is going to have very limited options very soon." "What kind of options?" He can cooperate with the DCI and take whatever deal the prosecutor offers, which will likely involve the property. Or he can fight and lose more. Patricia tapped her pen against her notepad. Either way, his ability to control that water rights situation ends. The question is what happens to the spring. I spoke to the Alderson family yesterday, Emma said. Patricia looked up. Nathan Harrison gave me their number. I called Margaret Alderson. She's the eldest. She handles the legal matters for the family. I told her what I knew about the water rights arrangement and Roy's connection to Cobb. Emma kept her voice level. She cried. She said they'd been trying to prove that connection for 3 years. Patricia was quiet for a moment. You called her before you talked to me. I called her after I'd filed a statement, and before anyone could tell her a different story. Emma met her attorney's gaze. I know the order of operations matters. Patricia looked at her for a long moment. Then she almost smiled. Yes, it does. What did Margaret Alderson say she wanted? She said what the family has always wanted: fair water access, and Cobb out of the picture. She's not interested in the property itself. She's interested in the rights. Emma paused. I told her that my interest in this property was never about the land. It was about making sure Cobb doesn't get what he built toward. And if Roy cooperates and the water rights are remanded to, I want them documented as non-transferable to Cobb or any entity he controls as a condition of any plea arrangement. Emma said it the way she'd rehearsed it at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. That's what I want from this. Not money, not the property. That. Patricia looked at her for another beat. Then she wrote something on her notepad with the deliberate motion of a person recording something significant. You've thought about this very carefully, she said. I've had a lot of practice thinking carefully under pressure. Patricia nodded, once closed her notepad, and said, The DCI detective arrives at 2. I'll be beside you. The DCI detective's name was Reyes, and he was younger than Emma expected. Maybe late 30s, with the specific quality of attentiveness that good investigators develop, the kind that makes you feel genuinely heard without making you feel exposed. He had Nathan's statement already taken by phone that morning, and he read portions of it back to Emma to confirm accuracy and the experience of hearing Nathan's words direct, specific, utterly without exaggeration. Describing what he'd seen from the ridge was something she had to absorb carefully because it had a weight to it she wasn't prepared for. Nathan had described the first morning he saw Roy hit her. He'd described the bruise he'd seen through the north window. He'd described the count of 7 incidents over 3 weeks of observation. He'd given dates and approximate times. He'd described Vickers' nocturnal circuits of the cabin perimeter, and he'd described with the same factual precision walking Emma out of that mountain in the dark. He'd made it sound simple. She knew it wasn't. Reyes asked her questions for 2 hours. When they were done, he closed his own notepad and leaned back and said, I want to tell you something off the record, Ms. Carter. Patricia's hand moved slightly on the table, professional reflex, but she didn't stop him. Roy Carter filed a counterstatement this morning at 9 a.m., Reyes said. He claims you were having an affair with Harrison, that Harrison manipulated you into leaving, that you've been mentally unstable since a medical episode 2 years ago that he can document. Emma felt Patricia's hand land briefly on her forearm. He also claims, Reyes continued, that any injuries you sustained were the result of accidents on the mountain. He said this last part with the flat even-handedness of someone reading from a script they find insulting. His attorney filed it at 9:07. Your statement was time-stamped 6:49 a.m. He paused. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what Roy filed this morning is not going to age well. Not against what we have. Not against what you gave us. Emma thought about 8 minutes. She thought about 47 minutes of recorded statement and Deputy Oakes's notepad and photographs taken in the cold dawn on the Valley Road. What happens to Roy? She said. That depends on how cooperative he is regarding Cobb. What I can tell you is that the water rights scheme has been under active investigation for 14 months, and what you've given us is the piece we were missing. Reyes met her eyes. Roy is going to be asked to make a choice. The choice is going to be unpleasant either way. But the people who've been harmed by this scheme for 30 years are going to get a resolution they haven't had. Emma nodded. One more thing, Reyes said. Cobb was located this morning, south of the state line. He said it without drama. He won't be operating in this county again. She took that in. She looked at Patricia, who gave her a small, precise nod that said, "This is what it looks like when it works." 3 days later, Emma went back up the mountain. She'd thought about it constantly, and she'd decided the way she decided most things now directly, without the prolonged second-guessing that Roy had trained into her. She needed to see it in daylight. She needed to walk the trail the way Nathan had offered, not running, not navigating in the dark by body memory, but as a person who could look at the terrain and understand what it was. Nathan met her at the bottom of the North Trail, at the split spruce with its distinctive fork, and he was there before she was, which she'd expected. He had coffee in a thermos that he handed to her without ceremony, and she took it, and they stood for a moment in the morning cold, which was still deep and would be for weeks yet, but which was different in daylight. Everything was different in daylight. "Roy accepted a deal," she said. "Patricia called me this morning. He cooperates fully with the DCI on Cobb's operations. The water rights are remanded back to neutral county administration, non-transferable to Cobb or any connected entity. He pleads to criminal harassment and 1 count of domestic assault." She paused. "He won't go to the mountain property. Ever." Nathan stood with his coffee and looked at the tree line. "How do you feel about it? Like justice and satisfying are different things, and this is the first one." She thought for a moment. "And like the first one matters more in the long run." He looked at her then. "That's the right read. The Aldersons get fair water access going forward. Margaret Alderson called me last night. She said, Emma stopped because the memory of that phone call was doing something to her composure, and she needed her composure for a while longer. She said her father would have cried to know it. He died 4 years ago, still fighting it." Nathan was quiet for a moment. 4 years, he said. "She said thank you so many times I had to ask her to stop." He exhaled something that was almost a laugh and almost something else. He handed her the thermos back. "Ready to walk?" "Yes." They walked the trail in daylight, and it was as she'd predicted, entirely different from the dark version. She could see the rock formations, and the way the terrain dipped and rose, and the specific beauty of spruce forest in winter. She let herself see it now because she wasn't navigating it, wasn't using it, wasn't counting steps to survive it. She could just look. "That's where you went down the second time," Nathan said, pointing to a section of rocky ground on the western face. "I know. I felt it for 2 days. You came back up in under a second." "I know that too." He looked at her sideways. "I've walked that face 100 times. I wouldn't want to run it in the dark." "I didn't want to either." She kept walking. "But wanting things was a luxury I wasn't working with." They reached the rock formation, the flat table stone, and she put her hand on it, the way she had in the dark, feeling the cold, rough surface of it, and it was smaller in daylight than it had seemed in the dark. Most things were. Not smaller than she'd imagined, though. Exactly the size she'd committed to memory, which meant her body had been accurate when nothing else was reliable. "My mother," Nathan said. She looked at him. He was standing a few feet away, looking at the rock, and he had the expression of a man choosing to say something he didn't say easily. "When she finally left," he said, "she told me afterward that the thing she'd needed most wasn't the help itself. The neighbor woman who helped her, it wasn't the food or the watching or any of the specific things." He paused. "She said it was knowing someone had decided she was worth the trouble." Emma stood with her hand on the cold rock. "She was," Emma said. "Yes." He looked at her directly. "So were you." The words arrived without decoration, the way Nathan said most things, without performance, without angle. Just the fact of them, and the fact of them was enough to loosen something in her chest that had been held tightly for longer than she could accurately remember. She didn't cry. That wasn't what this was. It was more like a bone resetting the relief of a thing returning to its right position after a long wrong one. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "In the beginning, when you were at the tree line those first weeks, I kept looking for the angle, the thing underneath. The reason a man watches a strange woman on a mountain for 3 weeks without coming closer." She looked at him. "I kept waiting for the moment when you'd become something I'd seen before." "And?" You never did. He held her gaze. I've spent 2 years learning to survive, she said. I'm going to need some time to learn to do something else, something other than just surviving. That makes sense. I don't know how long it takes. I've lived on this mountain 11 years, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him for a moment and thought about all the things that were not being said and that didn't need to be said, not yet. The space between surviving and living was not small, and she knew it. There were things in her that Roy had broken that would need to be rebuilt carefully in the right order by her own hands first, before anyone else's. She knew enough about construction of the internal kind to understand that foundation work was slow and necessary and could not be rushed. But she also knew that she was standing on a mountain in daylight with a man who'd walked beside her in the dark and not in front of her, and that this was not a small thing. It was in fact an enormous thing. It was the kind of thing you remembered at 70 when someone asked what changed your life. Let's keep walking, she said. They reached Nathan's cabin at mid-morning, and she stood in it differently than she had the night she'd arrived, shaking and frozen, moving on pure forward momentum. She stood in it as a person with the luxury of looking, and she looked. The shelves of practical supplies arranged with the economy of someone who'd learned what he needed and what he didn't. The single south-facing window with its view of the valley below. The wood stove that she'd stood over for 60 seconds on the worst night of her year and thought warm. You built this, she said. Most of it. The original structure was here when I bought the property. I rebuilt the interior. 11 years ago. Yes. She walked to the shelf on the east wall. Books she hadn't noticed them in the dark, 2 full rows of them. Field Guide's History, a few novels with cracked spines that said they'd been read more than once. Her hand stopped at one spine without her intending it to a book she'd loved at 20 and hadn't thought about in years. She pulled it out, looked at it. You've read this, she said. He looked at the title. 3 times. The third time was last winter. She put it back carefully. There was a long moment of the kind that doesn't need filling. Nathan, she said, after everything gets sorted, the legal work, the DCI case, the property, Carol wants me to come to Billings for a while. She turned from the shelf to face him. I'm going to go. I need to be somewhere familiar for a time, around people who knew me before all of this. You should do that. It might be several months. I know. She held his gaze. I'm not saying goodbye. I'm saying I need to go in order to come back correctly. Do you understand the difference? Something moved through his expression. The thing she'd seen before, that she hadn't been ready to name and was now willing to approach. It wasn't hope anymore, or it wasn't only hope. It was the expression of a man who has spent 11 years on a mountain, learning the difference between things that are temporary and things that are built to last, and who has just been told which category something belongs to. Yes, he said. I understand. She crossed the cabin and stopped in front of him and did something she hadn't planned. She put one hand against his chest, just her palm, flat against the fabric of his coat. The same gesture a person makes when they want to feel that something real is there. He didn't move. He didn't pull her in or step back. He just let her hand rest there and put his own hand over it briefly one moment, and then they both stepped back and the moment was complete. I'll write, she said. Real letters. You probably still get mail. Once a week when the road's clear. Then you'll get letters once a week. He almost smiled, the closest to a full one she'd seen. I'll write back. She left the mountain on a Thursday morning, a different Thursday than the one she'd planned for months ago, the one that had been overtaken by Wednesday night and Vicar and the frozen creek. This Thursday was voluntary and unhurried. And the truck she left in was driven by Deputy Oakes, who was heading to Missoula anyway, and offered without being asked, and Emma sat in the passenger seat and watched the valley road unreal ahead of her, and felt the particular texture of a departure that is not an escape. She had a bag this time, a real one packed with things she'd chosen. Patricia had arranged for Emma's personal belongings at the cabin to be collected under a civil order, and they'd arrived at the riverside in 2 boxes, and Emma had gone through them with the attention of a person sorting things into what to carry forward and what to leave. She'd left most of it, She'd kept a photograph of herself at 22, standing in a field in Wyoming, with her father's arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting into summer sun. She'd kept the book she'd been reading the week Roy smashed the phone because she'd never finished it, and she intended to. She'd kept a pair of wool socks her mother had knitted before she died, which Roy had never known about because she'd kept them at the bottom of the second box under everything else. She'd left everything that smelled like that cabin. Oakes drove and didn't require conversation, which was the right instinct. And Emma looked out at the mountains as they pulled away from them and thought about what Patricia had said that morning when they'd said goodbye. Patricia had shaken her hand and said, "You're going to be fine, not immediately and not without work. But you're going to be fine because you're the kind of person who figures out what needs to be done and does it." Emma had thanked her and meant it. She thought about that assessment, now turning it over as the mountains receded and the highway opened up ahead. The kind of person who figures out what needs to be done and does it. She hadn't felt like that person for 2 years. She'd felt like someone Roy's version of the world had reduced to pure reaction, hit, survive, endure, repeat. But the trail had been there. The signal on the third birch tree. The red scarf in the north window. The 47-minute statement at 6:49 in the morning. The phone call to Margaret Alderson before anyone could build a different story. Those weren't the actions of the woman Roy had been constructing. Those were the actions of the woman Emma Carter had been before Roy and had apparently remained underneath everything, waiting. She'd been there the whole time. She just hadn't had anyone watching from the tree line to help her remember it. She pulled out her phone and opened a new note and began writing. Not a letter. Yet. Not organized enough for that. Just the beginning of what she wanted to say to Nathan when she sat down to write it properly. She wrote, "I walked the trail again in my head on the way out of the valley. I still count the steps. 214 from the split spruce to the flat ground. I think I'll always count them." She looked at what she'd written and then added, "That's not a sad thing. It's a reminder of what I know how to do." She saved the note. Oakes turned onto the highway, and the mountains became the horizon, and then became smaller, and then became the kind of presence that is everywhere in Montana, even when you can't see it specifically, the knowledge of altitude and rock and cold permanence that sits at the back of everything in that landscape. Emma Carter sat with her bag at her feet, and her father's photograph in her coat pocket, and the number of a woman named Margaret Alderson in her phone, and a book she still intended to finish, and she faced the highway ahead. Behind her was a mountain that had tried to keep her. Ahead of her was a life that was entirely, finally her own. She had survived. The darkness walked out of it, step by counted step, and she had not come through it. Broken, she had come through it built. Built from the ground up in the cold and the dark by her own 2 hands, and the steady presence of a man who understood that the truest kind of care was the kind that walks beside and does not pull ahead. Emma Carter had been trapped. Emma Carter had gotten out. And now, for the first time in longer than she could measure, Emma Carter was simply going somewhere she had chosen to go. That was everything. That was enough. That was the beginning.